The fight has lasted 2 years, and the toll has gotten more imprecise and inflated. The exact extent of these losses is becoming harder to estimate due to conflicting reporting. This video will examine statistics, independent research, and vital data to determine the true cost of this conflict. To understand how the conflict is hurting both sides, watch Military Size and Casualties in Ukraine and Russia. This conflict will end through exhaustion of equipment and casualties, not a decisive battle. Nearly 2 years of fighting have taken a heavy toll on both sides. How many people have died since February 24, 2022, and how does this affect each side's ability to continue fighting and win? Casualties include dead, wounded, missing, and captured, not just fatalities. Ukraine had a population of about 44 million in 2021, while Russia had a population of 143.4 million, 3.2 times larger. According to the Global Firepower Index, Ukraine will have 22 million people by 2024, with 15.4 million eligible for military service and 47,000 of military age. Russia has 69.4 million, 46.4 million, and 1.2 million in the respective groups. 2 years of war have cost hundreds of thousands of casualties, but accurate estimates are difficult. Both sides are reluctant to release specific figures. Before the war, Ukraine had 300,000 active duty soldiers and paramilitaries. That has since grown to 2.2 million, with 900,000 active duty soldiers. Not all of the reserve and paramilitary forces were deployed at once. Russia began its offensive with 19,000 soldiers, not nearly enough. By May 2023, EU sources reported a rise to $300,000 thanks to a partial mobilization. By September 2023, Russian forces in Ukraine had reached 42,000, according to Ukrainian intelligence. Russia's total forces include 1.32 million active troops, 2 million reservists, and 25,000 paramilitary. But not all are deployed in Ukraine due to the need to protect its vast border. As for casualties, by June 2022, Ukraine reported 1,000 dead and 3,000 wounded. It was estimated that Russia lost 3 times more. Accounting for overestimates, this is a realistic idea because Ukraine was on the defensive as Russia invaded Donbass. Russia claimed in September that Ukraine had 61,000 deaths and 49,000 wounded, compared to 5,000 Russian deaths and 10 times fewer casualties. With Russian troops retreating and Ukraine reclaimed thousands of square kilometers, these estimates were ludicrous. Concrete, independent data arrived in 2023. PNS, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America, used 4609 reports of military and civilian losses from both sides and a statistical model to estimate each country's deaths in August. The writers considered both parties' reporting biases. The study indicated that both sides overestimated their opponent's losses. They stated Ukraine frequently doubles Russian casualties, while Russia estimated Ukraine had 4 times as many fatalities. PNAS also suggested that Russian sources underestimated casualties. Russia has had more total casualties and a higher proportion of fatalities, yet Russian media only disclose a third of their armed forces' fatalities. PNAS anticipated 1,700 deaths and 33,000 injuries in Ukraine by February 2024. The months-long war for Bakhmut cost Russia tens of thousands of lives. That month, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu claimed 11,000 casualties in the conflict, but Western officials said 3,000 Russian troops had died. They did not include the Wagner Group's mercenaries, who also suffered heavy losses in the conflict and revolted against Moscow immediately after the city fell. The Ukrainian garrison at Bakhmut caused disproportionate casualties. There was trouble in Ukraine. Ukraine prepared for its Zaporizhia counteroffensive during the Battle of Bakhmut. Western observers anticipated this operation would reach the Sea of Azov and break Russia's land bridge to Crimea. Ukraine failed to replicate its 2022 successes. The Ukrainian forces broke through the first two of Russia's three large Zaporizhia defensive lines, but failed to proceed. Casualties rose as Ukrainian forces attacked Europe's most complex defensive network since World War I. American sources indicated that Ukraine's casualties reached 12,000 injuries and 7,000 deaths by August 2023, during the Zaporizhia campaign. Even though Russia was on the defensive, it took more deaths than Ukraine in this conflict. The Institute for the Study of War reported in September that Russia's Storm Z detachments with convict recruits had arrived to cover regular army formations like the airborne forces. Russian troops were exploited as cannon fodder, resulting in hundreds of losses per day, even while the Ukrainian offensive failed to advance. With costly human wave tactics reminiscent of many earlier battles, Russia has likely lost more people than it acknowledges. Russian sources reported 5,900 deaths since the war began in June 2022. However, British intelligence sources estimated 15,000 and Ukrainian sources over 30. Given P&S biases, the British statistic is likely the most reliable at that stage in the conflict. P&S estimated around 15,000 Russian injuries and almost 7,000 deaths by February 2023. After the Russians captured Bakhmut at great cost and were suffering throughout Ukraine's Zaporizhia operation in August, American intelligence sources reported 12,000 deaths and 18,000 injuries. The source of this figure may be unreliable compared to another issued 2 months later, as it appears to be a high proportion of fatalities to overall casualties. An independent BBC and anti-Putin Russian news outlet, Mediazona, analyzed Russian cemetery data statistically. This analysis estimated 88,000 Russian deaths since the war. A month later, a Ukrainian army official stated on Facebook that Russia had 17,000 injuries and 15,000 deaths. The BBC Mediazona analysis is likely the most accurate. By March 2024, the British Ministry of Defense reported 35,000 Russian casualties in the two-year war, or 983 each day. 2 months ago, British experts expected around 500,000 Russian casualties by 2024. These are military casualties alone. War usually hurts civilians the most. Same this time? Russia assaulted Ukrainian civilian population centers despite international humanitarian accords. Russian-occupied civilians suffered more. UN sources reported 18,500 civilian casualties and 1,000 deaths in Ukraine in September 2022. Historical wars had minimal civilian to military losses. Verification concerns might raise the figures, according to the UN. The February-May 2022 Mariupol siege caused many of these casualties. Ukrainian reports say 25,000 people perished. However, they may have tried to exaggerate this number for information warfare against Russia. UN authorities reported 1,350 deaths, but naturally estimated much higher numbers. About 4,500 people lived in the city in January 2022. By May 2023, it had plummeted to 12,000, with the Institute for the Study of War alleging Russian documentation evidence of plans to ethnically cleanse and replace Ukrainians with Russians. UN sources report 500 civilian deaths and 1,047 injuries to minors. This is certainly an undercount because Russia attacked at least one Kharkiv school with cluster bombs, an unequivocal war crime that killed a child. Cluster bombs, especially Russian ones, fail up to 40% of the time. Unexploded bombs create landmines. It is not unexpected that mines and abandoned explosives caused at least 303 civilian deaths and 676 injuries. Ukraine is now the most mined country in the world, resulting in more civilian deaths. The February 2023 P&S study reported 13,000 Ukrainian civilian deaths and 19,000 injuries. A new UN estimate in February 2024 confirmed 34,557 civilian casualties, with close to 11,000 dead and 2,000 injured. In a total war of attrition, civilian fatalities deprive the enemy economy of labor and production. Despite international humanitarian law, the Russian military appears to be treating Ukrainian citizens this way, as it did during World War II. Russia has had few civilian losses because the battle has primarily been waged in Ukraine. It was not unharmed. Cross-border assaults like the May 2023 Belgorod raid and missile drone strikes have left their mark. By August 2023, 7x7, another Russian independent media outlet, estimated 105 civilian deaths, concentrated along the Ukraine border. Sometimes wounded warriors return to action, but not always. At least 2,000 Ukrainians injured needed amputations by December 2023, and a Russian source said that was being honest. Over half of the wounded soldiers needed amputations. Tens of thousands of troops have mental health difficulties. Lack of rotation, especially in Russia, has caused a mental health catastrophe. Drug and alcohol abuse is frequent. Although sources differ, it appears that Russia has incurred more casualties than Ukraine, and disproportionately. Russia can afford its casualties more easily than Ukraine, since they are more replaceable due to their greater population. Ukraine faces significant challenges in organizing its people for war. Since the invasion, many people have been refugees. Human resource loss from refugees. Between February and May 2022, 8 million Ukrainians were internally displaced. By the first anniversary of the war, another 8 million had become refugees, representing 37% of the pre-war population. The majority were women and children, ineligible for military service, but it is estimated that at least 2,000 Ukrainian men left to avoid being drafted. The situation gradually improved in late 2022 as some refugees returned after the Ukrainian counteroffensive, reducing the internally displaced to 5.1 million and the number of refugees abroad to 6.3 million. However, the war gradually turned against Ukraine. About 1 million Ukrainians were forcibly relocated to Russia, an act considered a war crime under the Geneva Conventions. The ICC has issued arrest warrants for Russian officials, including Putin, for this act. Not only did Ukraine lose manpower, but Russia also suffered significant losses in its military-age population. After Putin announced partial mobilization in the fall of 2022, hundreds of thousands of Russian men fled to avoid service. Since the beginning of the war, an estimated 9,000 Russians, at least 25,000 of the men, have left the country. This has reduced Russia's military manpower by the equivalent of a year's worth of replacement soldiers. Ukraine is facing a serious manpower crunch in its war of attrition with Russia. To address it, the draft law was amended in April 2024, lowering the age of conscription to 25 and expanding the pool of conscripts. It also toughens penalties for draft dodgers and allows criminals to join the military in some cases. Women, while not required to serve, have been given more fields to register for, such as journalism and music. The measures have been met with public criticism, but the Ukrainian military needs to replace its forces after 2 years of war. Russia currently outnumbers Ukraine by 7-10.1, despite heavy losses. Estonia estimates that Russia would need to eliminate at least 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers a year to win, while Ukraine would need to increase its losses to weaken Russia. Estonia also stressed the importance of improving the quality of Ukrainian military training, which lasts only 5 weeks compared to the U.S. standard of 10 weeks. Despite more than 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers trained by the West, there is still a large gap in combat effectiveness. In addition, military aid from the West has decreased, leading to an ammunition shortage in early 2024. However, large aid packages are expected to last until 2025. Ukraine has inflicted about 100,000 Russian casualties in the first 2 years of the war. With new equipment, such as F-16s, missiles, and ammunition, Ukraine hopes to meet Estonia's target of causing casualties. However, Russia may continue its human wave attack tactics, increasing pressure on Ukrainian forces. As the war drags on, the outcome will depend on the ability of both sides to organize, calculate, and effectively use resources. So, we examined some key figures and facts on the Ukrainian war's human cost. The true number of deaths and injuries reflects the conflict's size and its global impact. Understanding the current circumstances helps us appreciate the war's devastation and suffering, even though determining the exact figures is difficult. Thanks for watching. See you next time.